Hello, friends. Up to now, the mainstream media has been telling the US public how well the Ukraine army has been doing against the Russians. But the Ukrainian losses are so bad that even with all the propaganda and all the spin, the corporate media is having to start to admit that the Russians are gaining ground and the Russians are actually winning this conflict. There are two big narratives in the media that we've seen over the last couple of years. One is about a global disease with coerced injections. The second deals with the Ukraine crisis. Both are important narratives because they are part of what the globalists call the Great Reset. We're in end-stage crony capitalism right now, or you could call it corporate socialism, where banks and corporations get bailouts, basically welfare. And this system is a Ponzi system, this whole Federal Reserve banking system where these private central banks own everything, create money, do whatever they want. And so it's failing, and they're also trying to create a new system, what I would call neo-feudal technocracy, some kind of dystopian 1984 Brave New World technocracy / dictatorship. For those of us in the spiritual world, I would also call it the tribulation. They're bringing in the tribulation, although inadvertently, I don't think they're intentionally doing that, but I believe that is what's happening. So we're gonna, whatever prism you examine it through, it's, the same thing. And so I'm not gonna really delve into the global disease, coerced injection part of the narrative. I'm gonna look at the Ukraine crisis. So let's jump in. What makes Ukraine so important as far as the globalist agenda goes? First, let me state that the Ukrainian people are victims in this. They are not villains. They have been set up. They are being massacred. Their country is being destroyed. They were tricked, just like a large swath of the American population has been tricked through propaganda, CIA psyops, etc. So in no way, shape, or form blaming the Ukraine people. They are a beautiful people. They are the people of the earth. They are connected to agriculture and all sorts of wonderful things. It is a tragedy what is being done to them, and what is being done is being orchestrated by the globalists, make no mistake. Also, the Russian people are victims in this, and if you want to extend that, the US population and humanity as a whole. We are all victims of the globalist agenda. In the early 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed. And the quote unquote US bankers, really international bankers, like Goldman Sachs, Citigroup, all those guys came in under the direction of people like Robert Rubin. This was under the Clinton administration primarily. They came in and they looted Russia. They took, all the industries had been nationalized prior to that. They gave them to these oligarchs who they felt they could work with, and they divided up the profits. Ukraine was part of the former Soviet Union, and the same thing happened there. They installed these corrupt oligarchs, they looted the country, devastating, wiped out people's pensions. It was a nightmare. We're going to see similar things happening in the US. They've already started to happen. Once remember, the international bankers are like termites, that they just eat the foundations away from societies. They did it to the former Soviet Union. They're doing it in the US now. They do it all over the world. Well, once the collapse of the Soviet Union occurred, the US government promised Gorbachev, who was the head of the Soviet Union at the time, that NATO would not expand eastward towards Russia. This was a promise they made, which made sense because NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was formed to be a bulwark against the Soviet Union. So once the Soviet Union dissolved, there was no reason for NATO to exist. Of course, they still exist and they're causing trouble all over the world. They aren't worried about the Soviet Union. Their primary purpose is to prop up transnational corporations, international banking. And so the United States lied. They incorporated most of the countries of the Eastern Bloc into NATO and set up all along Russia's border. Now, there's a great video by John Mearsheimer. He's a top academic. He spoke about this. I'll try to remember to put a link to this video. You'll get the whole Ukraine thing in a nutshell from a academic perspective. I'm covering it from a larger perspective, and I don't claim to have Mearsheimer's academic understanding. I've synthesized a lot of his data, but I'm looking at it from other perspectives as well. Vladimir Putin said that the U.S. cannot bring the Ukraine into NATO. That is a red line, because if they were to do so, it is an existential threat to Russia. And to better understand this, just imagine Ukraine remember, it was part of the former Soviet Union. About half the population are ethnic Russians. This would be the equivalent of Russia going into Canada or Mexico and putting in military bases, missile sites, bioweapons labs all along the US-Mexican border or the US-Canadian border, and even firing missiles into, say, like New England, like Maine, attacking American citizens, killing them. It's a no-go, especially considering that the US has a history of attacking and destroying countries like Iraq, Syria, Libya, countries they want to loot. And they've already said they want to overthrow the Russian government and do the same thing. It's on record. So of course, Russia is opposed to this. Well, in 2014, the CIA sponsored a coup, put in their puppets, and they said, hey, we're bringing in Ukraine into NATO. And this was further exacerbated because there was a Ukrainian oligarch. He's an Israeli-Ukrainian dual national named Kolomoisky. And Kolomoisky, was one of those corrupt oligarchs that the bankers installed into power, looted the Ukrainian, industries and turned them over to Kolomoisky because he's in league with the bankers and the American government. And obviously, as an Israeli citizen, he's also aligned with Israel. And after this coup, Kolomoisky, he owned a media state. He owned a lot of media, and he created a program. I think it was called Man of the People, and it was starring an actor named Zelensky. Now you've heard predictive programming is where the CIA will put in things in television shows or movies to put them in your mind before they happen. This was predictive programming taken to the next level. And what they did in this TV show, they made Zelensky the president. And guess what? It was predictive programming on steroids, because in this comedy show where Zelensky played the president, soon after he ran for president, obviously bankrolled by Kolomoisky, his campaign, etc., the CIA, Soros, George Soros, and he did become president. And then the media, they flooded the media with all this CIA propaganda, anti-Russia. We've got to kick out the Russians, oppress the Russian ethnic population, and Ukrainians are susceptible to brainwashing, CIA psyops, just like the American people. We're no different. Look at how many people have bought into all these CIA narratives in the United States. So don't say, oh, well, the Ukrainians are gullible. No, they are no more gullible than most of the American population. What Kolomoisky also did was he bankrolled a private army called Azov. What makes this army interesting is they were a neo-Nazi army. They were very hardcore right-wing. They used Nazi symbols, insignias, flags. And some people will say, well, I don't get it. Kolomoisky's Jewish, he's an Israeli dual national. Zelensky's Jewish, he has strong ties to Israel as well. Why would they work with neo-Nazis? It's real politics. In other words, they'll work with whoever helps serve their agenda. Israel and the United States work with ISIS against President Bashar in Syria, even though ostensibly ISIS claims Israel as their enemy. So the marriage, so they say politics makes strange bedfellows, where here we have neo-Nazis and Jewish politicians and oligarchs who are linked to Israel, the CIA, working together. And that's just how it goes in politics. And so once the CIA had their man with Zelensky, Zelensky said, hey, we're bringing in NATO. We're going to become part of NATO, the Ukraine. And Russia said, no way. They were also, the CIA and the Pentagon were also building biolabs in Ukraine. Obviously, that's a threat to Russian national security. And so, the Russia was not going to have a NATO member in their bosom, missile silos, potential nuclear missiles just, minutes away from Russia. It wasn't going to happen. Russia eventually invaded eastern Ukraine to shut that down. And so one has to ask, what is the goal of the globalists? Why are they doing this? Why are they bringing in Ukraine into NATO? Well, there's several reasons. I'm sure there's more that I'm mentioning, but I'm going to mention a few of the big ones. The first is the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. That was where a pipeline was built. It was going to send in natural gas or energy from Russia to Germany. And so the US doesn't want that for several reasons. And so what this Russia's incursion into the Ukraine basically did, which they were baited into it. It shut down the Nord Stream 2 deal. Germany will not be getting its energy from Russia. As a matter of fact, it seems like Europe as a whole is getting their energy supply closed off from Russia, which supplies, even without the Nord Stream 2, it supplied a lot of Europe's energy. And in a circuitous way through Turkey and stuff. I think they still do, although it's being reduced. And so by shutting down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, the US wants to shut down Germany. They want to make sure Germany is under the US thumb, that it's a vassal state. This is reminiscent of the Berlin to Baghdad Railway, which was one of the major reasons for World War I. The German Kaiser was building a railway from Berlin to Baghdad to get oil supplies from Iraq. And the British Empire did not like that, so that was one of the reasons why World War I was started, to shut that down. Well, history doesn't repeat, it rhymes, and here we see a similar situation where an energy pipeline is being shut down, even through war if necessary. Another thing that this Ukraine crisis does is it shuts down the relationship between Europe and China, particularly Germany again, because China was also building railways into Germany through its Belt and Road Initiative. This deal has shut that down. In addition, there's a lot of farmland in the Ukraine. Ukraine is called the breadbasket of the world. It produces a lot of grain. Just like Bill Gates is buying up all the farmland in the United States to control the global food supply, He wants that Ukrainian farmland. You know, he's aligned with Monsanto, a very evil company that was purchased, that created Agent Orange, which was used in Vietnam. It's herbicide, deadly, caused many deaths, cancers, mutations. Anyway, totally, if you look at the Monsanto family, they were originally a slave trading family. They got their money through slave trading, very evil. And so these globalists want to control the global food chain. Obviously, controlling Ukrainian farmland would help facilitate that. Another thing that this Ukraine crisis does is they hope they would destabilize Russia, just like they looted Russia in the 1990s. They want to loot Russia again. Russia has huge mineral deposits, metals, natural gas, oil. The multinational corporations, the bankers would have a field day looting that country, making it part of their empire, global empire. And then, of course, after they neutralize Russia, China would be the next victim on the list. Iran, obviously. All countries that are not under control of the central banking system, aka the Federal Reserve, aka the 8 private banking families. Another component is to make the Ukraine part of Greater Israel. There's a history there in Ukraine, if you know the history, the Pale of Settlement and so forth. And so Israel would have an outpost in Europe, just like they have in the United States and in the Middle East. They want to replace the native Ukrainian population. Obviously, they would come in with settlers, just like they do in the West Bank, and they would take over there. Also, Israel, there are huge natural gas deposits that have been found along the coastline of Israel, although they're disputed because Lebanon claims them and Syria claims them. But anyway, Israel wants to eventually supply, after the U.S., once the Israeli government can get that set up, they'd like to supply Europe with their natural gas. So they would be a captive audience. So they have to knock out the Russians. And if you look at Genie Energy, one of the big energy corporations there, who's on the board of directors, Dick Cheney, Ward Rothschild, Rupert Murdoch of Fox News, News Corp. You can see the players who are involved. And it's the same players, same type of globalists. If you look at the names, it's Ukraine, the global illness, the injections for the global illness. It's one big incestuous network. Never will forget about the military-industrial complex. We just sent $40 billion to U.S. taxpayers, to Ukraine, and I think there's another $750 million in missiles and weapons. I think javelins. So this is a windfall for them. I mean, look at the trillions that were spent in the Middle East wars, Iraq, Syria, Libya. These guys are making a fortune. And Ukraine was also a great staging ground for the biolabs. For the last few years, we've been under bio warfare. And so they would have these biolabs along Russia's border to unleash, the Pentagon and the CIA could unleash whatever pathogens they wanted. The globalists may have underestimated the situation, and and I'm hoping it will turn out to be an epic fail for the globalists. They looted about $300 billion in assets from Russia. They just stole it. The federal bank, the central banks, Federal Reserve just stole Russia's money that were in various accounts under the auspices of the central bank. They stole it. That made a lot of countries leery of keeping their money in the Federal Reserve / central bank. And so what Russia has done, what China's starting to do, they're involving India, other countries in the Belt and Road Initiative, is they are starting to create alternatives to the SWIFT system. And the SWIFT system is the electronic transfer system where all monies are transferred. It's controlled by the United States. But if there are alternate systems set up, then other countries could bypass the system. So right now, the United States could seize any country's assets. shut them down economically. They, did in Venezuela, Cuba. And so they're creating an alternate system. This will damage the petrodollar considerably because the petrodollar, the US petrodollar, is global dollar, this unit of global currency. If there are alternatives to that, then it will be a problem for the US dollar, which will be a problem for the US economy, because once all those dollars go out of circulation, they'll come home. You have hyperinflation, all kinds of economic collapse. And even though the globalists want a US collapse, they want a controlled collapse. If we get a collapse that goes out of control, we could get civil war. They may even want a civil war, but this might be a civil war that gets out of their hands. And so ultimately, this orchestrated Ukraine crisis may come back to hurt the globalists. And from the macro picture, it may cause irreparable damage to what I call the Rothschild, Rockefeller, satanic matrix. And we can only hope for that, because their intentions for humanity are on a level of evil that is almost incomprehensible. I hope I've given you greater insight into what's going on in the Ukraine. Take care of yourselves, and thanks for listening.